Hello, Unity travelers, and welcome. In this video, I'm going to be connecting our login page UI that we've created in the past videos to code so that we can actually start to have some action in our UI when we play our application and log in. So I'm going to start with the username and password. We're just going to create a new script in order to do something with the username and password field. I will point out right now, if you hit play, you can already type into these fields. They just, obviously won't do anything yet. So let's create a new folder. So right click, create folder. I'm going to call it scripts. I'm going to go into that. I'm going to right click again, create, and C# script. And I'm going to name this login manager. Okay, so I'm going to double click it to open it. That'll open Visual Studio for me. I use Visual Studio. If you want to use something else, that's totally fine too. I think Unity now comes with Visual Studio, but you might still need to install it if this is your first time running it. Okay, so we've got our class, our login manager class. For very beginners, I want to go through real quick what start and update are because that's what's already in the script. So these are Unity functions. So the language we're using is C#, and these functions are specific to Unity. So they're not necessarily a part of C#. They are written in C#, but these start and update are specific to Unity, and they work the way they sound. Start when your application starts. That's when this function will get called, and it will get called once. Well, not necessarily when your application starts, when the scene starts. So if you have multiple scenes, then this can get called separately. So, and then update is called every frame, as you can see here. Update is called every frame that this script is running. So keep that in mind. If the script is not in your game, just because you have an update doesn't mean it will run. It needs to actually be attached to something in your game, and I'll show you how to do that later. So, but to start, we want to get access to our input field so that we can read it, write to it, whatever we want to do with it. So that input field is called first we have to add a using. So this will pull in a library that we need. And since we are working with TextMesh Pro input fields, which if you saw in the last video, I explained why we use TextMesh Pro rather than just regular text. So since we are using TextMesh Pro input fields, we need to pull in TextMesh Pro. It should autofill for you if you're using Visual Studio and if you open your script from Unity. Okay, so now that we have that, outside start, I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to make it public. And for an input field, it's a TextMesh Pro. I always forget the naming. The good thing is you can look it up here. I think there it is, TMP input field. So this is TextMesh Pro input field. And we're going to call this username input field. Okay? And then we'll do the same thing for password. And the last thing that we have is the button. The button we don't actually need to do anything with. We're going to call its function from the editor, not from script. And so we don't actually need a reference to it in the script. So that is the purpose of creating these two variables here, is we want to get a reference to these so that we can grab the text that's inside them. So if I save this and I go back to Unity, let's create a new object, and we want to actually create an empty object. So if you go to here, you'll see I right-clicked and then click Create Empty, and we'll call this Login Manager. So I like to put my scripts on empty objects, that way, or at least on the object that they're related to, so that way it's easier to find them later. I also like to, and this is just a preference thing, but a lot of people do it. For some reason, when you create an empty object in Unity or an object at all, sometimes the position is weird. And so I just like to reset it, which you'll see puts it back at 0, 0, 0. It doesn't matter if it's at 0, 0, 0, but I will say that you can see that our script is now attached to an object, which is right here. And so that's nice for later if you have a ton of empty objects. It's nice for them to all be in the same place, so you know, okay, all of my managers, all of my whatever objects are all at 0, 0, 0. So anyways, and then so now we need to attach our new script we just created. There's a couple ways you can do that. You can either select it and drag it in, or you can click Add Component and you can type the name and find it. And you'll see now in the editor, we have fields to attach our username and password input field. And notice the type. They are TMP input fields. If you try to give it an object that is not of that type, it will not accept it. So let me go back to the script real quick and explain how this works. So the reason why that field shows up in Unity is because we made it public. So public serializes the field, and that will allow the field to show up in the editor. Let's see what happens when we make it private. You'll see the field disappears. And so good programming practice is to make stuff private when it doesn't need to show up in the editor, and also when other scripts don't need to access it. Okay? Because first of all, we don't want to clutter the editor. So if you have a ton of public stuff that doesn't need to be public, you'll clutter the editor. The second thing, and I'll give you an example right here. Let's say I have an integer, and we'll call this count. Let's say by default, I want count to start at 2. Okay? I go to the editor, you can see we have this count, but it's not 2. So now it's confusing. Which value do you think is going to be used? This 0 or this 2 value that I set? I'll give you a second to think about that. So the value that gets used is actually whatever comes from the editor. It's always editor first, then what's in the script. So if I really want this value to always be 2, it's actually just safer to make it private. So now it doesn't show up in the editor, and I know that the value that it is here is the value that it's going to be. So keep that in mind. It's better to do private when you know that you don't want to set it in the editor. And even better than making it public, because public makes this variable accessible to all scripts. And again, you can have clutter when you're auto-completing, right? Like all this autocomplete stuff, you can have a ton of clutter if you have too many variables that are public to all scripts. So an even better solution is to make this private and then add this decorator serialize field. So this makes it so it's a private field that will now show up in the editor because it is serialized. So it won't be usable by other scripts, but it will show up in the editor. So if we go back to the editor now, you'll see it looks exactly the same. And so most of the time, this is actually what you want to do if you want to follow good programming practices, because this will keep the clutter away from other scripts, because these input fields, there's almost no reason I ever want another script to be able to access them. So instead, or another class to access them. So instead, I make them private inside the script, but I still make them editable in the editor. So, and then the last thing I'll show you, it's another decorator. Let's say you do want it to be accessible by other scripts, but you don't want it to, let me put =2 again, but you don't want it to show up in the editor. You can also do hide in inspector. Okay, and so now this will be public, so other scripts will be able to access it, but it won't show up in the editor. So if I go back to Unity, you'll see it's not there. Okay, anyways. So we have username and password input field. We don't need to do anything at start at the moment, so I'm just going to get rid of these for now. Just clear up the clutter a little bit. What we really want to do is when we hit the submit button, we want to grab the values that are inside the username input field and the password input field. So to have something happen when the button is pressed, we're going to create a function. So let's call this, well, let's make it private again because, or no, sorry, we actually do need to make this public because we're going to use it in the editor. But this is a function, so a function you wouldn't serialize. So before I talked about using that decorator serialized field, that's only for variables, not for functions. Keep that in mind. So we say what type, we say we want it to be public, we say what it's going to return, in this case void. We don't want it to return anything. And then we name the function, let's call it on submit login. We'll call it that for now. And it doesn't need any parameters. And so this function, which we'll call later, by the way, to make this summary thing pop up, you just do 3 forward slashes and it'll auto-generate this, at least in Visual Studio. So we'll say called when the submit is pressed. We'll grab the username and password, and later we'll do some checking and we'll check they are correct. We'll do some very simple checking. Okay, so on submit login, let's start by grabbing the username. So I'm going to create a string variable. Notice how I didn't put private or public. If you don't put anything, it's just assumed that it's private. And since this string is going to be local to this function, we just don't put private. We just want it to be private. So I'm going to put a string for username, and that is going to be equal to the username input field dot text. So the TextMesh Pro input field, the text that is within that TextMesh Pro input field. So this will return a string, and that'll be our username. We do the same thing for password, password input field dot text. Again, it's just going to return a string. So now we have our username and password. This is where we would begin checking that information. But for now, I'm just going to log that information so you can see that it's doing something. So to log something to the console, we just do debug.log, and we will do username and you can just concatenate two strings, which is what this would be, right? We have our username string and we have this. And then we will also debug.log password. Well, let me make it all caps, just like the other one. Okay. So we need to make sure this function gets called now, so we need to connect it, but this should log our username and password that we typed in. So let's go back to Unity and let's find our submit button, because this is where we're going to be calling our function. And so you'll see in the button component, we have this onClick field. This is going to be a callback, and we're going to put in our callback. So our script login manager is on login manager. So we want to drag that object into here because that object has our script. And then we can select this dropdown and you'll see login manager popped up. And we want to select our function, which on submit login right there. So that's it. Now our button will call this function when it is pressed. Okay, the other thing we need to make sure we do, though, is fill in these fields. You get an error if you don't do that. So if we go back to Login Manager, you'll see these fields aren't filled out. So we're going to drag in the input field part, which maybe I should rename so it's a little more clear. Username text input field. Password text input field. And how do we know that these are input fields? They should have the input field component. That's how we know that they're input fields. Okay, so then we drag in the password input field. Okay, so now if we hit play, we can type in username 1. You won't be able to see this password, but password 1. And if I open up the console here, when we hit submit, oops, I have this turned off, you'll now see that our username and password popped up. So we are correctly grabbing that information. I'll try a different one. I don't want collapse, so you can see multiple. And you'll see that username 2 popped up and same password. Okay, so we are grabbing that information, and now we can do something with that information. So if I open up this again, let's create a new function that will be the checking of the username and password. So check login info is what I'll call it. This actually doesn't need to be public because it's actually going to be called inside this function, and it's not something we need to call from the editor. So I'm actually going to make it private. And in fact, do we want it to return void? What we could do is actually have it return a bool that tells us whether their login is acceptable or whether there's something wrong with it. We could also do a string, and the string could be empty if it's good, and it could have a message in it that says what's wrong with it. We could do that as well. So I kind of like the string idea more, but you can see this is kind of a decision thing what you want to do. I'm going to have it return a string. And here what I'm going to do is we're going to call check login info, and we're going to store the string it returns. So string, let's call this login message or login check message equals check login info. Okay. And let's talk about real quick what this will return using summary. Which again, 3 forward slashes. So this will return an empty or null string for correct login. Otherwise, it will return a string that explains the error. Okay, and just to put a summary of what this does, checks that the input login information is acceptable and correct. Okay, so now let's write this function check login info. And you'll notice it's in red because we haven't returned a string yet. So let's create a string that we're going to return. So we can call this return string for now. And let's make it an empty string. So you can decide whatever you want on what kind of metrics you would want to check login. I'm going to do something very simple, just for this series. But you would probably, if you were doing a real login page, you would want to check on some server somewhere and make sure that that information, that username exists, that password is attached to that username, stuff like that. So anyways, I'm just going to check if their username is not empty. So if username, which we actually should grab, or no, we should pass that in. Let's pass in the username and let's pass in the password. Right, so I'm adding parameters now to pass in, and so in check login info, we can now pass in these values that we gathered up above, right? So with that username, now we have the username. I can check if username, and actually I'm going to do if string dot is null or empty. This is a nice, efficient way to check if a string is empty or even null. Either way, it will return true if it's empty, false if it's not. So if username is empty, then return string, I want to change return string to username was empty. Okay, so that's kind of like our error message. Else, if string dot is null or empty password, return string equals password was empty. Oops. What do we want to do if both are empty? So I think actually we want to do something first to check if they're both empty. So this is how we do that. We do if string dot is null or empty username, and then we do 2 ampersands to say and, essentially, and then string dot is null or empty password. So first we check if both are empty. Oops, return string. This shouldn't be return. That's wrong. Return string equals both username and password are empty. Okay, so let's talk about this real quick. So if they're both empty, then we can say both username and password are empty. This should be an else if. So now we know that one of them isn't empty if we get to this, right? If we get to here, to these else ifs, then we know that either username isn't empty or password isn't empty. So now let's check if username isn't empty, or check if username is empty, excuse me. If username is empty, then we'll return this. Once we get to here, we know that username is not empty. So now we'll check if password is empty. And if none of this happens, we know the fields were filled out. So we can do an else. And we can just, in fact, we don't even need an else, but we can just set the return string to blank. return strings are already blank, so we actually don't need this. I'll leave it just for to help understand what's happening. So one more time, if both are empty, we return this. Otherwise, we check if username is empty. If it is, we return this. Otherwise, we check if password is empty. If so, we return this. And finally, if none of that happens, essentially nothing is empty, we're just going to return an empty string. So finally, at the bottom, we will return string. And I also would just like to print out return string. Return string. And again, we'll concatenate it. There we go. So that string will be stored here. We'll do something with it in a second, but for now, let's just test this code and see if it works. So when we run it, we should see return string print out. You can see both username and password are empty, right? So because I didn't type anything, let's type in a username. Password was empty. Okay, let's type in a password. Let me clear this so it's a little easier. Let me move it up a tiny bit. Oops, that's not what I want to do. Okay, not that much. Username was empty, and finally, return string is empty because nothing was empty. So it's all good. Okay, so I'm going to go back here now. And let's now use that info. So check login info. This is going to return essentially what we just saw, that string. So that's the login check message. So if string.is null or empty login check message, what does this mean? This means that they put in everything correctly in our case, and so they should essentially log in. So log in. And I'll just even log that. Log in. Else, so otherwise there was some sort of an error. We know that there was some sort of an error if it's not empty. So if there's some sort of an error, we can log the error. We can say something like we can actually do debug.log error. And then we can say something like error and concatenate our message. Okay, and so let's test that real quick. Okay, good, we got an error. Let me get rid of these other logs now. We don't need those. Make it a little clearer. Okay, so we got an error. What if we type in everything? No error, we logged in. Good. Okay. So that's kind of essentially what I wanted to get through as far as the beginner level programming and connecting it. So in the next video, we'll actually do something after you log in, like switch scene. But for now, this is a good place to stop for this video. So look for my next video to continue this series, and thank you for watching.